I'm Margaret with Civic Nebraska's Voting Rights Team, and today on the Long March Forward for Voting Rights, we take a look at the struggle of the differently abled to secure voting rights in the U.S. When talking about the issue, language becomes problematic as the legislation often bears insensitive terminology itself. The 1800s ushered in a rise in the number of institutions designed to house people with a multitude of disabilities: cognitive, developmental, physical, and emotional. These institutions focused on restraining and controlling patients rather than on treatment. The differently abled faced severe prejudice, and their families often severed all ties, leaving them to spend the entirety of their lives within the walls of the institution. During the 1950s and 1960s, the discovery of clopramazole and other antipsychotic drugs played an important role in permitting some deinstitutionalization. But it was the rise of social movements that led to sweeping changes in the lives of differently abled people. When services for people with disabilities moved from institutional governmental systems to community-based services. In 1973, President Nixon signed the Rehabilitation Act. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, those receiving federal financial assistance, and it also prohibited in federal employment and in the employment practices of federal contractors. In 1977, the failure of the federal government to enforce Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act initiates a series of protests by disability rights activists for enforcement of their civil rights. Protesters created a Capitol crawl where they threw down their crutches and their wheelchairs, dragging themselves up the steps of governmental buildings. In San Francisco, a large group of activists from multiple organizations held a sit-in inside the federal building that lasted for 25 days. Their demands were eventually met, and regulations were signed into law by the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare on April 28, 1977. The 1984 Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act promoted the fundamental right to vote by improving access for handicapped and elderly individuals to registration facilities and polling places for federal elections. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act is signed by President George H.W. Bush. It prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. With me today is Quentin Corwin, our York County chapter leader. Quentin, can you tell us what voting means to you?
Voting means to me, voting rights for people with a disability is an important issue for me, especially as a person who's disabled in a way. I think I can remember like 4 years ago when we had our last presidential election, like 60% of our polling places were non-accessible for people with disabilities. When I first read that just broke my heart. And I knew that this is an issue that seriously needed to be dealt with, and legislators need to figure out what in the world is going on. Instead, we have something like other ballot initiatives going around here in the state of Nebraska that are just going to harm people with disabilities. And pretty much everyone here in the state of Nebraska, especially with this new voter ID initiative that's going on, that just got started about a month ago, this is something that we need to deal with now, and something that needs to be prioritized in the next upcoming legislative session. Even though states can have their own right to make their own rules and laws regarding voting rights, the federal government can still have that overreach to make a difference. Another barrier is guardian or guardianship. The reason that's another barrier is because they will ask the court to limit their voting rights just because some people, they think that they might not have the right barriers to vote in the first place, and their mental capacity might not be at ease to even vote in the first place. So I think that's kind of one of the ways that where we need to fix things, especially in that certain area of guardian or guardianship. Most people with disabilities are disheartened that their rights to access to voting rights are being dismembered, varying by state, especially here in Nebraska. But I think here in Nebraska that we can make a change here in Nebraska, not just here in York or Lincoln or Omaha, but we can make change in our entire state or even in our entire country.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Quentin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Our volunteer poll observers help ensure ADA compliance on polling locations across the state. To join our election protection team, scan the QR code on the screen, or you can visit civicnebraska.org to see the latest report on ADA compliance. You too can join the Long March Forward for Voting Rights.